Just a few minutes on LGS trials, some general points focusing on outcome measures and then where we're going in the future. So we'll look at how outcome measures have evolved over the years. We'll talk about DEEs. I know the term DEE has been discussed. I will introduce it with one slide, and then we'll talk about the ongoing LGS DEE trial. And then we'll talk a bit about non-seizure outcomes, which I must admit I have nothing breaking to say about non-seizure outcomes other than they are very important and they are very difficult to measure, especially in short-term regulatory trials. So here is a list of the FDA-approved anti-seizure medicines for Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And on the right side of the screen, you see the various primary efficacy endpoints, which have ranged over the years. Back in the day, felbamate did a combination of an EEG outcome and a seizure diary. EEGs have largely not been part of primary outcomes since then. And then hop on down to clobazam in 2011, where the outcome drop seizure was introduced used for the first time as a primary outcome via a diary. And then that was maintained as the primary outcome for cannabidiol and fenfluramine. We have now started to move away from drop seizures, but I wanted to go back and just remind everybody how this started, this outcome measure. So this is taken from the randomized controlled trial publication of clobazam, drop seizure. So it was recorded by patients or parents or caregivers in seizure diaries. A drop was defined as a drop attack or spell involving the entire body, trunk, or head that led to a fall, injury, slumping in a chair, or the patient's head hitting a surface, or that could have led to a fall injury depending on the patient's position at the time of the attack. So that's a mouthful. That was open to interpretation. What does that mean? Yet it was a very successful primary outcome measure, not just in this trial, but in others as well. The other thing about the clobazam trial was their primary outcome, which was median % seizure reduction in drop seizures, came in 3 different flavors, which was unusual and to my knowledge not been duplicated. So drop seizures were recorded as a single seizure. Okay. Last sentence, for clusters, an exact number of drop seizures. Okay, we're used to that. Or a range, 10 to 20, or greater than 20. Now, very often in trials, investigators have said, why can't we do that? Because statistically, it's very challenging to mix in your primary outcome, categorical numbers. There were 15 seizures versus there were 12 plus a range of 10 to 20 plus one that was greater than 20, but I'm not sure how many. That is tricky to do in a primary outcome, so that has not been duplicated. So I say this about an older outcome to basically introduce what is a newer outcome, not just in the bexicaserin trial, but in some other trials where drop seizures are not being used and it's been replaced by something that may be a little more intuitive, countable motor seizures. Is there a motor component and can you count it as a discrete number of seizures? And you see here the list of 6 primary outcome countable motor seizures in the bexicaserin trial, which is ongoing. And then there are non-countable seizures in the same trial, some of which have a motor component, which causes some questions, like myoclonic seizures are quite motor, epileptic spasms are quite motor, but they tend to be hard to count. So the 6 seizure types on the prior slide are the most reliable seizure types that can be counted as discrete events, either as single seizures or as countable clusters or back-to-back seizures. So that's as fancy as countable motor seizures get. It is meant to be as simple as possible. But of course, there's always a few curveballs like epileptic spasms are motor. My patient can count them. Well, sorry, it's still a secondary seizure outcome. It's still important, but it's still a secondary seizure outcome. So this list will drive the outcome vote for the bexicaserin trial. The other thing that you have heard about a lot, this slide may have been shown today, I'm sorry if it was, but it is a very important slide, and there is one part that is really I won't say controversy, the big variable. All right, so epilepsy has an etiology, and it might be structural, or it might be genetic, or it might be both, or it might be unknown. And then that etiology can lead to seizures. So the orange up arrow is not controversial. And that etiology can lead to developmental slowing or regression. The other up orange arrow, yellow arrow is not controversial. The tricky part is the width of the blue arrow. How thick is that blue arrow where seizures and/or epileptiform activity cause developmental slowing and regression? In some patients, they clearly do. In others, not so much. We know, unfortunately, that we can control seizures in some DEEs and development does not improve. So as we navigate the DEE spectrum, I think our big challenge is to grapple with the density, the thickness of that blue horizontal arrow. Now, DEE, to those who have been in this world, it's another very basic, of course there are lots of DEEs. And there's so much talk about DEEs, and some people say, well, is this some fundamental biological advance? No, not at all. It's basically this slide. This slide is what DEEs mean, and it will be applied through many different known and unknown epilepsy types. So, as many of you know, there is a phase 3 global trial going on. The compound is bexicaserin. One of the novel part of the trial is that there are 3 arms, a Dravet arm, which we won't really talk about much today, and then an LGS arm with a traditional LGS set of inclusion criteria, and then the DEE arm, which is, to be honest, a lot like the LGS criteria, except the age of onset is a little younger, and the slow spike in wave and GPFA requirements are not there. So it's largely a different, more liberal EEG inclusion criteria. And the FDA has accepted this as a potential path forward if the pivotal trials are positive. Now, of course, they have to be positive, and there's a lot of work to do in that front. This is all based on a prior trial, and you have probably seen these results of bexicaserin studied in those 3 groups, Dravet, LGS, and DEE other. There was a placebo arm. The placebos were randomly distributed, so the Dravet arm didn't have any placebo patients. The big news that I think was not a surprise to anyone who practices pediatric epilepsy is that the response rate of the LGS arm and the DE other arm were similar. Yes, because they seem to be the same entity in many, many ways, share many of the same unmet needs. It's just the EEG criteria is a little bit different. The seizure types often overlap. So this led to the phase 3 trial, which is ongoing. So a little bit about non-seizure outcome measures. So the clobazam trial back in the day had a variety of non-seizure outcome measures, child behavior checklist, the aberrant behavior checklist, and a quality of life scale. None figured in the label. None were breaking news in the pivotal trial. But based on the clinical trial data and other data, sort of a profile is developed. And we do this with all medicines in our head. So behavior, mood, cognition, neutral, didn't help, didn't hurt in a major way, did lead to sedation. And of course, if it's sedating, it might help with sleep. So bexicaserin has different non-seizure outcome measures, a quality of life inventory, a neurobehavior evaluation tool, a caregiver sleep assessment, which is, I think, a novel outcome assessment, and then some EEG outcomes, which are optional. So let's just say non-seizure outcomes are hard, particularly hard in regulatory trials. All of us have to work together to do a better job with that. So that's how I spent my 10 minutes. So countable motor seizures hopefully will be a valid outcome. And thanks to all of you, and I look forward to the other talks.